Good afternoon, everybody. So it's very nice to be here in this panel discussion, the second panel discussion of this already long St. Anthony's Day. So I really would like to thank the audience to be here and to being such a very good contributors for the development of this meeting. So today it has been a really very exciting meeting for all of us. We have been having from scientific presentations to ethicist discussions, legal implications, and also the hypes and hopes of communication, or let's say miscommunication. To try to start the discussion, I would like to turn first of all to the two scientists that started the afternoon session, in which we had such a great time on this information. First by Angel Haya, where he was telling us how we can model such an important and troublesome disease as Parkinson's disease using iPS cells, and also from Janet Rossan that took us through this amazing journey on the discovery of stem cells and the use of stem cells to study developmental biology, therapies, etc. So we have been amazed by these recent 10, 15 years of these amazing discoveries in stem cell research related areas. So what could you envisage that would be the next potential scientific or technological breakthroughs, or what would be the necessary new breakthroughs that could lead this exciting science a step farther?
You go.
I always hate those questions. So I think it depends what area we're looking at. If we're thinking about stem cells for treating disease, I'm not sure that we need breakthroughs. I think we need hard work. I think that we have the tools, we have the cells, we have the ability to differentiate those cells in many cases into appropriate cells, but not quite the right cells. We need to understand how to mature cells. We need to understand how to grow more cells. We need to understand how to combine them with biomaterials. So it's hard work more than a major breakthrough is the way I look at it.
That's the way to see it. Thank you. So, Angel?
Well, to some point, I agree. I think the basic foundations on how to use cells to regenerate or to substitute for the function of a missing organ or tissue are there. And I don't know. I think there's still there is a breakthrough missing that we don't know when or if will happen, which is making these things bigger. We need to vascularize somehow things that you create in the lab if you want to use them for organ transplantation or to make big things that will be meaningful upon transplantation. And that is something where many people are working on, but I really don't see. This is what happens with breakthroughs. I mean, sometimes they happen, and sometimes they don't, and you cannot anticipate. But those
I don't disagree. And certainly, if you turn back the clock 10 years ago and asked me, would I have predicted what we can do today with gene editing, with all these things, the answer would be I wouldn't predict. So there still could be a breakthrough down the road. But in terms of vascularizing cells, I think we have, actually, the components. We talked about culturing human embryos, and they're not doing very well. But if you put bioengineers in a room, locked the door, and gave them lots and lots of money and all the resources, they could come up with the components to generate the niche in which to grow an embryo. I think they will come up with the components to generate tissues and organs.
No, again, I agree. I just see that if the thing that happens when you do that is they move on to the next hot thing.
Yeah.
So nobody pursues that to the point that it can be applicable. And that, I think, is something that it doesn't have to do with science, but it has to do with the way we plan to exploit this. And this is something that needs to be solved. These are truly expensive therapies.
Okay, I think I would pick up in this last two words, expensive therapies. Embryonic stem cell, regenerative medicine is currently the hype, it's the current radio of the 21st century. So it's a very competitive field. It's also a very expensive field. What do you think that would be the role of scientific institutions in, as it says in Europe now, lower research-intensive countries like Portugal or even like in Pakistan? How can research institutions in these countries can contribute? What would be the role of these lower research-intensive countries in the stem cell research?
Well, I mean, I think some of the basic science still does not cost a whole load of money, and there's still a lot of basic science to be done in terms of understanding stem cells and their differentiation. I think the building up in consortium, joining in with some of the bigger countries to really develop parts of the piece, because taking a stem cell from a dish to a treatment requires many, many different people coming together. So I think there are opportunities for people in many different countries, and the EU is a great opportunity to do those kind of things and make consortia happen.
Any other comment?
No, well, I totally agree. There are several consortia. I think what people have realized in general is that this is not a one lab or one country endeavor, and that we need to come together, and there are many consortia across the board from making banks of clinical grade iPS cells to making off-the-shelf products that need to be distributed. And there, anybody can chip in under the conditions that they can. And every effort is welcome.
I thought you were going to go to the issue of access, which is a huge issue. So if we translate these therapies into stuff that can really be brought forward to the clinic, how do we ensure equitable access, and how do we ensure the cost of these treatments are not outrageous? And I think this is a big issue for stem cell, but indeed for any of sort of innovative therapies that are coming up, somatic gene therapy and so on. So I think this is something that scientists and clinicians and researchers in this area should be thinking about, the costs and the equitable access to this. And it's not an easy question to answer. For gene editing, as you know, this is really the area where there's a lot of hype. But the hype in this case, things are moving really quite rapidly to the clinic, but a lot of companies are heavily involved here, and the costs, again, are going to be very high. Can we, as scientists, should we be going back and looking at the way we develop these therapies and trying to come up with low-cost solutions? CRISPR-Cas9, I said it's cheap. It is cheap. The components are cheap. What's expensive is all the preparation and the viruses, and you want to deliver it as a product. That's what costs money. We need to think about cheap delivery, putting these in nanospheres, being able to go to Africa and injecting people with sickle cell anemia with CRISPR-Cas9 into their blood system and have it fix it right there. So that's the goal we should be going for.
So the question also here that it was raised during some of the presentation is the ethical concerns. And these ethical concerns, for my point of view, they go along with the scientific advances because, as you were referring, stem cell science and the use of embryos, first mouse embryos, but later on human embryos. So it's not the use of the stem cell itself and the potential so much initially, but that you would need to use one embryo with the potential to give rise to a living animal. We also, as human beings, are living animals, so to generalize between human and mice. So, but to use an embryo to derive stem cells. But then afterwards, so this generates several ethical concerns. But then afterwards, with with the generation of the IPS. So generating cells with pluripotentiality that could be derived by skin fibroblasts, we would envisage that most of these ethical concerns would not be so much prevalent. But in fact, they generated other ethical concerns. So ethical concerns go along with the scientific advancements. Is this something that is intrinsic for us as human beings that we need, and in a positive manner, to challenge any major advance? So we need to question ourselves about what we are doing?
Yes, I'm very concerned about that from a medical legal point of view, because let's say that you're using fetal tissue. What has the bearer of that fetal tissue, the pregnant woman, has she agreed to have that tissue used? Because if you have a spontaneous abortion at the hospital, they take the products of conception away. The patient assumes that that product has been destroyed. And if it's not being destroyed, but being used for scientific purposes, who does that product belong to? I think the courts would be very clear to say that that product belongs to that woman. I mean, we're seeing the fight now with where fathers and mothers who have frozen eggs, fertilized eggs, are fighting in the courts about who owns that product. So I think that scientists have to be very careful at the first step to be sure that the product that they are using for their scientific research is legally in their hands. That doesn't mean that they've done anything wrong, but that people have thought about this and been sure that they've got the permission. And I think most people, most human beings, if they're told that, may we have your products of conception to use in stem cell research, to hopefully advance our discoveries and work in this, I'm sure almost everyone would agree to that. Where people become upset is where they're not asked, they're not part of the decision making, and then they see huge amounts of money being made down the road, maybe decades down the road, based on the product that they unknowingly contributed to it. So it's much better right up front for everybody to be open about this. And institutions can do this. You can do consent forms to give to patients and discuss it with them up front. It doesn't mean the scientist has to be there, him or herself. It can be done through physicians. You are always approaching practicing physicians to gather subjects or for research. This is no different. Just because it's just a cell, just because it's a piece of human tissue that would normally be destroyed, that does not mean it is any less valuable to that person.
It's interesting. I want to echo something that you said in your presentation. I really think we need these flexible regulatory regimes. I think it's always a mistake to ban, to out ban in a piece of legislation. I think we need to, you look at places like the UK where they had a regulatory regime that was already in place. I think that's almost, because we don't know where science is going to go. We don't know the direction science is going to go. And I think our response to gene editing, we talked about this over coffee, is a sign that we as a science, include myself in this community, are getting better. I think we're seeing this, I think a more nuanced response quicker than we saw with Dolly, that we saw with somatic cell nuclear transfer, that we saw even with the early embryo concerns, which we've been arguing about for decades now, right? It's been a long time. So I think if I was going to give any piece of advice, it is to really move towards the creation of a regulatory regime that's flexible enough to handle this. The cliche is, and we've even heard it a couple times, and I don't mean that in a derogatory manner today, that law and ethics are always falling behind science. And that's not always the case. Sometimes law awkwardly leaps ahead, thinking that they need to. And we saw that happen in Canada, where in Canada, we have a very, I would argue, restrictive environment. I think it's the product of bad luck, because we were debating this right when Dolly was happening, right when we had embryonic stem cell research. We had the Raelians, we had these controversies that allowed this very restrictive and quite all-encompassing regime form. So I think we need to be really, really careful how we respond to these technologies and avoid the use of, I would call legislative bans.
Janet, would you?
If I may, I will distinguish clearly the two ethical implications. One is that related to misconduct, or not asking for informed control, or falsifying your data. I think that's there, and the law should make sure, and this is getting out of, everybody understands, or should understand, that truly informed consent should be obtained before doing that. That said, every time is, at least in my case, more difficult to get access to fetal material, because everybody now aborts at home and not at the hospital. So that's, but of course, if you get access prior to that, you need to obtain informed control. A different set of ethics problems is trying to push the boundary of what is allowed. And I think this is what we have to do. I mean, we are exploring at the boundary. We need, and probably society needs to protect from scientists in that sense. Because if I'm allowed to go to 14 days, I want to go 15. And and I will push. I will not go 15 because that has penal consequences. But if I will advocate to challenge that, and that we need that. I think this is what we have to do.
And I really think that as long as the subject or the subject who is producing the material is aware of that, I really believe in people being willing to help scientists most of the time. I think if scientists just ask or make sure that the people that are providing the samples to them, if they're sure that they've asked, there would be very few refusals. Yes, there will be religious considerations in some areas. There will be limitations put on it in some area. You would want to tell the person that it's not going to be used beyond 14 days because the law doesn't allow it. What's going to happen to it after? I mean, I'll tell you a story that doesn't have anything to do with stem cell, but it's quite shocking. When I was in university, I was sitting beside a fellow, and he came to class, and he was just totally shaken up because he'd been called by the medical department to go and see them, and his mother had died 9 years before, and they were giving him the ashes, and all they did was there was a box there waiting for him to pick it up. And that was his mother's ashes. She donated her body to medical science. That type of interaction with the public does not reflect well on scientists. And I think when scientists are dealing with live tissue, I think that society as a whole expects more information on it. And that only helps, and I'm not being critical in that only helps. You want to bring the public into your bailiwick. You want the public to be supporting scientific research. And so the more the public is truthfully informed, and we know from what Tim was saying how badly hoodwinked the public is so often, get them on your side. And that's how you're more successful in getting research monies, because the public are educated by scientists if they're out there talking about it, and use crowdfunding for legitimate things, or whatever. Not that I'm advocating crowdfunding, but...
Okay, so now I would like to try to engage the audience in posing some questions.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. It was very fruitful discussion, and especially the insight to come from this part of the world. My name is Miriam Mohammed Matar. I am from Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and I'm talking from other part of the world. I am the first generation in my family who's able to write and read, and you can see the difference. I am 43, and my mother, she's only 58 years old. You can imagine when she got me. So going back to my community, I understand from where you are coming that we need to educate the community, we need to involve the patient, we need to involve them. But on the other hand, in that part of the world where I'm coming in, we have other responsibility toward our community because they are looking very high to us to help them to take the right decision on the behalf of the whole community. So sometimes we believe that it is dangerous to involve people who won't be able to understand from where we are coming. And on top of that, we have a huge challenge when it's come to our ethics related to our religion with all different branches of my religion, Islamic religion. I'm not saying it's bad, but it is another barrier. So I do respect your advice and your opinion where we need to involve the community, where we need to be very cautious about this information. I come back, I would like to share with you ask you another question related to this part. It's good to have all those framework which help us to protect ourselves as a scientist. I am an MD and PhD in genetics and epigenetics. But in the same time, we are a very young generation. My country is only 50 years old, and 62% of my population are below age of 30. And when we come to this part of the world, Europe and US, they are more interested in all those illnesses, which is related to the majority of their population, which is aging population. So our interest area, it's not priority in the list of research in this part of the world. So we had to go behind all those new, let's say, not yet proven intervention when it's come to treat Duchenne muscular dystrophy, other rare diseases, which is unfortunately not uncommon in my community. So I believe we as a scientist from that part of the world, we would like you to be more flexible with us when it's come to ethics, patient right. We do respect that, we do understand that, but we have other force which sometimes force us to go beyond those limitations and a framework which all of us agree when it's come to ethics and patient rights. So we hope in the next time when you have such type of discussion to consider somebody from that part of the world to come and share our opinion. And I did my PhD from planet Japan, and it is a planet by itself. All what I heard today, it's all in a clinical trial and a big debate, should we apply it on the clinical or not. There in Osaka, there is already 11 cases with cardiomyopathy where they were treated with 9 sheets of a stem cell developed in the lab, where now, last year in 2018, it was fully covered by insurance. And now today here we are talking, shall we do it or not? I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but we need to look at that part of the world who is really doing great. We are not doing it maybe the perfect way, which this part would like us to perform, but there is a perfect impact when it's come to human being, which might be one of those patients, your father or your brother, where you will be struggling to go and save him regardless of what ethics or a debate will be here.
Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, and I particularly agree that we need to hear from people all over the world. I think diversity is a key to this type of conversation. You know, fewer people like me and a broader, I think, a broader representation. There have been developments like the ISSCR guidelines that are meant for the world, that tried to integrate voices, particularly Japan and Asia, into the development of their recommendations. And I think that is, it's been recognized, and I think that and Janet can back this up, whenever we have these international conversations, this comes up. So I think people are aware of it and are trying to do better, but we can always do better in that domain. I also think you made an interesting point about for brevity's sake, I'll call it an uneducated population. That is also a real challenge, but there's research that shows that you can do it, right? So I think Rose was talking about sort of individual decision making. When you're talking about developing policies for a country, whether it's Canada or Bangladesh or wherever, you can, I think we need experts like you. We need those voices to inform the production of the guidelines, but you can still get, you can use methodologies to get the perspective of the population in a meaningful way. And so I absolutely think we need to have guidelines that are developed, that are informed from science, that are informed from experts in ethics, but also I think we need to hear, regardless of the country, from the people that those laws are going to apply to. So I think that and the last thing I'll say, and I'll pass it on, because you raised Japan as an example, and Janet can talk about this too. As you may or may, you probably know this, their approach has been greatly criticized as being not a clinical trial, as being a big phase 4 study that is not going to produce good data. There have been people who have been very critical, people in Japan. Doug Sipp, for example, has been very so I'm not saying I'm necessarily against it, but people are aware of that model. They're watching it closely, and not everyone's a fan of it. I'm worried about it. You can probably tell, because I'm worried it's going to help to fuel the unproven stem cell market that I was talking about. So I think that you've made some really important points, and I could not agree more with the diversity point that you raised at the beginning.
Yeah, I certainly agree on the diversity issue, and I agree that it is difficult where, in fact, in any country, the population at large is uneducated about stem cells. So I think there's always need to develop better and better communication tools, and they can be adjusted to different kinds of environments. It is important to engage people with an understanding. I got back to the Japan example, which you raised, which is, do we need these complex trials that are going to go on for years before we actually approve something? Or do we need to say that for these kind of innovative therapies, and stem cells will just be one of them, that we need a different regulatory environment that allows things to move to the clinic with a follow-up afterwards, which is basically the Japanese idea. The question is, at what point do you let it go? And I think many of us would argue that the bar in Japan currently is pretty low. And certainly the cardiac example you quoted, I would say that the evidence that stem cell treatment was efficacious was very low, and even the safety one could question. So it's now gone into clinical practice with the hope that they'll be able to follow up patients. It is also a good way for companies who are in this space to get their trials done for free. Because, in fact, once it's in the healthcare system in Japan, it's paid for from the public purse. So all they have to do is put in a follow-up process. So I think there's quite a lot of companies who see Japan as a good market. So, there's a lot of issues at play here. But I do believe that the standard clinical trial process is not going to be applicable to these kind of innovative therapies. And gene editing is the same. You won't have large populations that you can do these controlled trials. You're going to have to think of different ways of doing it. But we do need to know about safety, and we need to know that the treatment works.
Real quickly, there are a lot of really powerful examples about where they had an observational study, thought that it was efficacious, went out and did a clinical trial, turns out it's not. The PRP one I use, PRP has been observational studies, phase 4, and then they do the clinical trials, it doesn't work. There was the big one on vitamin D that just came out with diabetes, it was, right? They've long thought it was effective. You do a good controlled clinical trial, turns out it doesn't work at all, right? So it's a real good demonstration of the dangers of the Japanese model. Sorry.
I just want to make the comment. In Canada, with our Aboriginal peoples, we have found out more and more that they were really taken advantage of in studies that were done, unauthorized studies on them, on children, on adults who didn't understand at the time. At the time, there was no, they didn't complain because they didn't know what was happening. So I think communication is really, really important so that the scientists are protected as well as the people, so that they can understand what's going on, whatever model you decide to use. I think communication is key in it. And we in the West have to recognize and respect that there are different ways of doing things in different countries.
Here?
Can I just add one thing?
Yes,
to that?
while the microphone.
Okay. Again, I think most of the times that we speak, we have this very Western-centric attitude, which I understand needs to be corrected. But that said, I think from what we have learned, I kind of got from your comment that you were afraid that you are getting late to that and you need to rush and maybe not be as rigorous as we are saying. If that is not, then okay, because my
What's your priority in your country as part of the world is completely different than our priority of those list of disorder, which should be sat on the priority of the agenda in my country. I'll give you a small example only to correct you. Maybe you misunderstood me. In my lovely country, it's called United Arab Emirates. In 2004, every week one child used to born with thalassemia, beta thalassemia. And the prevalence of this disorder was 12% in my country. But in 2017, November, we celebrated the birth of last child born with this disorder, simply because in 2004, we decided as a government to enforce a law where we don't allow any two couples get married without having the screening of 3 common genetic disorders which can be preventable, and the preventive tool is available, accessible, and affordable. And by enforcing this law in the beginning, we faced huge resistance from the community. But as soon as they saw the impact of such intervention from the government, you cannot imagine the support which we got. And from introducing a law for one illness, right now we have a law which enforces screening for 12 most common genetic disorders in my lovely country. And additional to that, we added sexually transmitted disease. So with the one element which was maybe many people, they will say it's not right, it's again human rights, you didn't take the permission of the community. But as soon they understood and they saw the impact, now the community forcing us to go furthermore in other genetic disorders. And we do the same with familial hypercholesterolemia. Unfortunately, with the prevalence alarming in my lovely country. Right now, we are dropping it dramatically. But again, we do that in a very low profile, and we didn't involve the media, because we know the media, they have their own agenda, and we don't know how they will address the issue for the community. So we had our own approach to the community, which worked. Maybe it doesn't fit with international guidelines of a public health, which I studied, but we had to do it our own way, and it works. But I'm not saying it's a different approach, nothing right and wrong, but with a different approach and different challenges. I hope you understand me from where I'm coming.
And I think all what you say is very much in line with what you were saying.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And here.
No, it's all right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because obviously the solutions will be different and the environment is very different. Just to give you some word of support, when I went to England in '74 and I was part of a team there, and my senior physician said, you have to go to that patient and ask for informed consent. I had no idea about informed consent. And I graduated from a very respected school in Lisbon. I got in '66. I was a very good student. I got a scholarship. When I arrived at London, I had no idea about informed consent. So there are very differences, even in Europe. And I'm telling you this so that you can understand how even when we speak and try to get a common language, it's not easy to do that. On top of that, now from my point of view of a previous rector, I don't judge the quality of science in universities in China, although I know that the rector has got side by side a member of the Communist Party to run the... So we have to be very open about this. If we really want to solve the problems of the world, we don't have truth in ourselves, and as long as it is regulated, as long as it is clear, as long as we know what we're speaking about, I'm not sure that you are entitled to do everything, but at least you do it in the open, and you have to be very clear about this. Nobody has got the whole truth, nobody has got the clean solution. So I think that your point was very important. I'm sorry to do this. I have a question. My question relates exactly what Janet Rosen said about the funding. There'll be a lot of money. I'm very greedy, so I'd like to know if there are clear-cut data on the amount of funding in the last 5 years for stem cell research. And this is easy to do in your country or in the United States, compared with the amount of money that people individually are spending to get failure and treatment. This will be very interesting, because my question relates to Timothy, to the experience of senior people who don't come up to talk about things that go wrong when they did everything right, okay? I'm not talking about, we know homeopathy, we know all these. People that have a grant, did it all right, but the trial didn't work. So what I find from Europe, and maybe it's a little bit different from the United States, is that very senior scientists don't speak about these issues, they only speak about success. And I think that one of the problems that we have here is not just the education of the people. I'm very concerned now about elites. In Europe, we spend a lot of centuries trying to educate the people, and the people are very well educated. They know very well about their health, their rights, the way they live. Is when you reach a certain senior position and you are faced with the press is a very difficult and tricky situation to handle. You obviously like to defend yourselves. You don't speak about the things that didn't work. Do you have that experience in Canada or the United States?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that there is growing pressure and growing recognition that we need to publish negative trials. In fact, I know all the scientists in the room would agree, that is a valuable point of data, right? And so I think that there is, we've actually done research at our institute, funded by the Stem Cell Network, on the impact of the commercialization pressure on science, and it's not good. It's hard to get, again, it's hard to get causative data. So it was association data that we had, but it is associated with hype. It's associated with the problems that you describe. I think that there is growing recognition, even over my career. I'd say even over the last 10 years, of this problem. There, as everyone in this room probably knows, the replication issue has been noted. The publishing of negative trials has been noted. All of those things, I think, are growing in recognition. But also the problem of the bad journals, like the predatory journals I described. So I think there's growing, and this is a field that I've been watching very, very closely. It's starting to get more attention. The problem of science hype. Having said that, the problem of big science is with us. I mean, you were talking about priorities, and Carl and I were talking about this earlier. It is, given what makes people sick, what really makes populations sick, is this a good idea for society for us to be spending this amount of time and energy? Now, I am actually a believer. Carl and I were also talking about this over coffee. You don't know where science is going to take you. I'm a believer in funding science in liberal democracies. We don't know where it's going to take us. But this goes, I think, more also to both of your points about doing some kind of evaluation of where we are going to place our research funds.
Well, I think that we have limited resources, limited financial resources. And I think the more dialogue that can occur as to where the money is best spent. And with the scientists that I have the privilege to interact with, most of them really believe that you should publish failed clinical trials. Because for one thing, they were paid for by the taxpayer by and large. And I think most people say, okay, well, you tried that, it didn't work. Because I, like Tim, really believe in science and I want us to push forward. But I think we've got to publicize and acknowledge our failures as well as our successes. And that too will help politicians and other scientists and everyone else to get on board. Because if 100 scientists in the world are doing the same failed study, that's just a waste of money. Exactly. So why don't you share those failures and move on to the next frontier where you might be successful?
One short comment. They share it, but they don't publicize it.
Yeah.
That's right.
Obviously, we know that there are these networks, very serious. I'm talking about serious scientists, not about the things that you've shown. They know it, but they have an obligation to society to publish it and to announce it. This is where I think, I always say that the very clever people can do more damage than 100 stupid people.
But
this is a very important issue for the future when we have lack of resources.
And it's even worse than you described, because what's also happening is the results are spun. And there have been recent studies have shown in the context of cardiac research how often the data is spun in order to make it look like it's more positive than it really is. And I'm not even saying they're necessarily doing this consciously, right? It's a systemic problem, right? It's a systemic problem. There was an interesting movement, and I think it was in nephrology, where they had the exact same data. I don't know if you guys saw this. They could only publish the methods and the conclusions, and they had someone else write and the person that did the study came to one conclusion, and then the blinded person came to the exact opposite conclusion using the same data, right? And keep in mind, the first one was peer-reviewed and published. So it is a real problem science having. But the good news, as I said, I think it's being recognized and increasingly so. And about the resources issue, reducing the world smoking rate by 3% or 2% would probably have a bigger impact in public health than the Human Genome Project and all of the money that we've spent on stem cells.
Thank you. So we move to this over there. Can you please state your name, please?
Hi, I'm Ehsan Massoud. I'm a British science journalist from the UK. And I just wanted to echo, Timothy, your point that you made a little earlier about language. Because I think, I stand, and so many of my colleagues, we don't think carefully enough about the language that you use. But sometimes I think the same sometimes could apply within the community of scientists as well, because so much of what we report and what we cover these days comes from within universities. Every university that's represented here and elsewhere, you all have media offices and communications teams. And sometimes a relationship between the principal investigator and the press office isn't quite as tight and as good as it would be. So for example, and this would be a great topic perhaps for more discussion or future research, is the use of the word breakthrough. I've heard it many times today. Now where I work, we don't use the word breakthrough because it's not just the fact that it's potentially dangerous, but actually it's misleading, because genuinely real breakthroughs are really few and far between. CRISPR in your context is perhaps one of them. But a more incremental advance, of course, doesn't sell. And your media offices know what sells. They know the kinds of stuff that we, in the journalism community, the things that drive us. And so it's a very chicken and egg situation. We have certain requirements and demands, and at the same time, your media teams understand that. And sometimes they're not talking to you in terms of what is accurate and what is right. So certainly in a lot of our publications, and I also represent an association, the Association of British Science Writers, we've made it a policy amongst our member organizations that we will, as much as possible, not use the word breakthrough where we can. But it's interesting that I see that word often coming out of the university world, and I've heard it today.
If I could comment real briefly, I think that is, and there has, sounds like you probably know this, there have actually been interesting studies on the use of the word breakthrough and revolution and paradigm shift, and the hype is going up and up and up in scientific literature, and they've done studies on that. And part of it's the sell. The pressure and the competition to sell your work is intensifying, especially when you're talking about big science. And by the way, the research, the ethical, legal, and social community social science community is guilty too of this. You know, we did a study, we call it ethics hype. The same thing happens in our community. You know, everything's a disaster. You know, everything is an ethical nightmare. Everything is a problem. And you can look at a couple, I actually think the area of genetic discrimination, that problem of genetic discrimination, it's a real problem, but the magnitude was almost entirely made by our community. If you look at the empirical evidence to support it, it's very, very thin. Same with the gene patenting problem. I mean, the number of papers that were written on the gene patenting problem you could build a university out of, but the empirical evidence to support it, again, wasn't there. So there's a lot of really interesting examples. It happens everywhere. And as I said, I'm going to go back to the good news story. I think, I wonder if you agree with me, there's growing recognition of this problem. Whether it'll actually turn the ship, I'm not sure.
May I add something on that? Because that is something that really worries me. I'm sure it's not the case in the UK, but at least in Spain, the quality of science journalists has, well, basically an entire generation have retired and they have not been replaced. Or they have been replaced with interns that copy and paste from the news agencies. And that is something that affects journalism in general, but science journalism much more evidently. And in the end, who writes the news are the news, well, the communication offices from the institutions. So that's something that I really don't see a solution for that. And I don't think it's going to be based, at least in the light of the priority of journalism and in general. And that really worries me.
Nasir Lalani from Aga Khan University. So I've got a couple of questions for the panel in general. Firstly, I think you mentioned the fact that in your studies you noticed that these fake treatments were nearly always offered by, or at least engaged, doctors. And they start, when they finish their training, we all taught about first do no harm. So the question arises, from an ethical perspective and a legal perspective, how come these individuals are allowed to continue to practice when they themselves know that what they're doing is harming the patient? And what should be the role of both universities that train medical students and the colleges that you mentioned? So that's the first question. The second question relates to science exploitation. The fact that you are going to bring, there are more regulatory frameworks coming in. You shared the example of what the FDA is doing. And so when that happens, these same companies are going to go to the parts of the world where the other 6 billion people live. And that could be an economic invitation by some countries to say, come here. And you can continue doing this, and you can continue to offer those treatments. And those individuals, whether they were from the east, from the west, from the north or the south, will go to these countries, and it could be an economic driver. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, I work a lot with regulators, and the problem with the challenge for medical regulators is that they need complaints made to them. They are always telling me they don't go and look for problems. They need to have complaints made to them. And I think people, like when I read things like that, I just ignore them because I think they're just nonsense. But that's not the average person. So maybe it becomes incumbent upon somebody like me then to go to the college and say, I want you to look into this, I'm making a complaint. But it creates a lot of work and hassle for people. But so the regulators, I just want to stress the point that in my world, the regulators don't go out looking. Somebody has to complain first about it. And I totally agree with you on the moving on to other countries. That's what's happened with big tobacco. We sued big tobacco, Canadians sued big tobacco, so they've gone bankrupt now in Canada, and they've moved to other countries. And a few years ago, I was in China, and I was seeing exactly the same advertising for cigarette sales as I had seen in Canada 35 years ago. They're not even making new ads, they're just using the same old advertisements.
So, sorry, I want to comment on the. I agree with Rose. The complaint issue is issue, and when I speak to the general public, I'll go. People complain. I'll ask the audience to complain, to issue complaints. And we're actually producing a document that's coming out in the near future where we actually outline exactly how you engage the public, which should engage all the different regulatory agencies, what websites to go to, how to do it. The problem, though, is we, as part of our research, what we did for the Stem Cell Network, we actually did complain. We did official complaints to these regulatory agencies to find out how they would respond. You know what we got? Silence, right? So I talked to the registers of the colleges of physicians and surgeons, and I talked to them in the United States also, and they are very reluctant to get involved. And I think I actually, you can tell by my voice, I'm furious about it, because I think this is exactly their legislated obligation. It's the best interest of the patients and the public that they should be concerned about, not the welfare of their members. Their legal obligation is to the public. And they're very hesitant. And Rose, for a lot of them, I won't say which colleges I've talked to, but I've talked to several. They try to say, well, we're not really sure if it's medical practice or not. And maybe, and the other thing I want to emphasize is these are not fringe doctors. These are orthopedic surgeons who are affiliated with universities. Yeah. These are not fringe doctors. So you can see why the public would think this was entirely legitimate. And this is exactly why we have regulatory agencies, not just in Canada, but around the world, in Mexico, everywhere. This is exactly their job, to protect the public from this.
And I think what they should be doing, it's not just for medical stuff, but for cosmetics or whatever. You see, it's usually a man standing there with a white doctor's coat on. I mean, I think the regulators should be on that and saying, you are attempting to portray this actor as a member of our profession and cease and desist.
Okay, so yeah, another question, and we are getting shorter in time, and I see still some raised hands, so I ask for you to ask short questions, and I also would urge our speakers to try to.
Okay, short question, I'm here. And also just a very short addition to what we're saying right now, and no one has mentioned this, but I wanted to also discuss a bit, the publishing houses also have a big impact on this, because if you're a scientist and you don't use words like breakthrough or innovation and all these things, but you have a perfectly good data and robust experiment, you don't get it published anywhere. So this is also a big problem. But my actual question is a bit of an ethics one, and maybe it seems a bit childish, but so if you consent to give your biological material to be used for science, and from that there is a big discovery and a multi-billion euro industry that comes from this, are you entitled to any financial compensation, because it's still your biological material that gave rise to this, and without you it would have been impossible? So
I can answer that very quickly. We're waiting for a court case to work its way through in the United States with a woman whose tissue or blood samples were taken decades ago to see if her family's entitled to recover monies for that at all. And there was also a case in the United States where a portion of a liver, I believe it was, that was taken and used without the patient understanding what was going to happen, and a lot of money was made. And maybe Tim recalls the result, but I think that in that case, the patient did recover money. That's why it's so important to be upfront right away. You know.
I can answer. Not in Europe. Yeah. In Europe, you cannot.
They didn't get money.
He didn't get any money.
Yeah, that's Canada too.
Can
Thank you very much.
Can I comment on the hype thing? You're absolutely right. There's a cycle of hype. It goes from granting to writing the publication, to writing the abstract, to writing the press release, to going to the media, to going to commercial. It's this hype pipeline, and all along there's a little bit of distortion.
A quick comment and a quick question. Yeah. The comment is, thank you for reframing such an intricate topic for most or all of us to understand. I'm not a scientist, but I am a social scientist. For the last 20 years, I've been told I don't really understand about this side of science. But I think it is necessary, and you just gave us a demonstration today, this morning and this afternoon, about how to make your topic, your topic of study, of work, of investment, of research, our topic. And that is something we all need to invest in, probably, to overcome such issues as you've shared with us this afternoon, which is communication, information, understanding. So my question steers towards this. I work here in Lisbon, and I work with communities, migrant communities, new arrival, undocumented people who need to have access to health, to education, to a number of sectors. And what we hear mostly is that the barrier is language. And this afternoon's panel has confirmed that the real barrier is actually not language, is a lack of information and a lack of understanding. So my question is, what can we do to provide vehicles and that kind of understanding to society, to the general population, in order for each one of us to make our informed choices, rather than having somebody else to make those choices for us. And the second question is about informed consent. It is another brick we've just hit here, which is, again, the public health services are providing these pieces of paper in Portuguese language, which is quite complex. Yes, they can be, of course, translated for the new Bengali and Nepali communities, etc. But actually, the real problem is what was mentioned in the first question this afternoon, which is about how do we deconstruct the cultural understanding needed to interpret what that consent actually implies, because it is not a language barrier, I believe, but as Rose was mentioning this afternoon, a lot of it has to do with the concepts behind it for people to be able to make those choices. Thank you.
Well, in Canada, I had to go to our highest court on informed consent, and the court made it very clear, and the Supreme Court sets the law for all across Canada. The court was very clear that the consent process is through dialogue. Written material may be of assistance in discussing it, but that it's the dialogue. And also the other thing, and that was a clinical situation, that was where a patient suffered a stroke following a surgical procedure. But the other thing the court said, and what I always say when I lecture, is that it is preferred that the person holding the knife or doing whatever ultimately is the one that's discussing it with the patient. And in Canada, when a patient goes to an institution, there are two types of consent. There's the institutional consent, which is usually long and complicated, and I'm sure the person can't understand what it means. And then there's the actual treatment consent with the physician that's going to be treating the patient, which must be, in order to be successful in a lawsuit brought by the patient, to have been a true information giving situation. And, you know, I'm very struck by a highly educated physician who would have graduated from medical school and not known about informed consent, and I can understand that. So I think that the scientists and the practitioners in this room shouldn't assume that people working with them, first of all, understand informed consent and are able to explain it to patients. And that happens in our system as well, where residents are sent off to get a consent and they have no idea what it means. So you're not alone.
Thank you.
This was a long time ago.
No, but it's even happening now. It's even happening now.
Now we have.
Yeah.
But it's the same as the picture that you just showed.
So with the communication thing, I think that there is some really wonderful literature on this right now, particularly coming from the vaccination community, about using creative communication strategies. So Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. We've tried to use all of these methods ourselves in the area of stem cells, using short videos. We have a project called SciPop, #SciPop, where we brought together artists to make images about a particular image. I have one, a particular topic. I have one on science hype I could circulate. I think those kinds of strategies work, and there's been interesting empirical research in the context of vaccines, but I think the data would be relevant everywhere, that if you use those kinds of strategies, you can make a difference. And narratives, of course, I think is another really important part of the equation. I'm still a believer in getting across the good science. I know there's the deficit model that, just pouring more data on people doesn't work, but I still think that's important too, to at least have that information there.
Thank you. So up there.
Can I comment just one thing on that? It's very quick because I think we as scientists have the obligation to communicate and all that. But I also think that we need to be accountable for what we communicate.
Oh yeah, I agree.
And I think this is something that I have proposed in Spain and almost got me killed by my peers. But I think we really need to put patient advocacy groups or organizations in the funding committees. And they need to see what we say we're going to be doing and what we have done, and have them decide on and then we will change.
In the ISSCR guidelines, we tried to, and I think we wanted to use stronger language, but to make it an ethical obligation of the scientific community not to hype their research and to engage the public when science is being misrepresented. I think that language is still there. The spirit of that idea is still there, but I agree with you.
They should be sitting there.
Okay, finally.
My name is Mansour Saleh. I'm an oncologist, and I want to follow up on Professor Lalani's question. What I've learned today is that the gap between high-income countries and low- and middle-income countries has grown bigger, even more so because of stem cell research. Janet comes from Toronto. Professor Lalani's laboratory is in Karachi, low-income country. And Janet says that she could use nanotechnology to use CRISPR-R into sickle cell patients in Africa. So my question specifically to Janet, would you be willing to take your lab from Toronto to go to Alan Lalani's lab in Kenya, in Karachi, or come to our lab in the AKU in Nairobi and do exactly what you're doing to gap this bridge that has been built as a result of this knowledge that you've shared with us today?
Well, I wish it were me. I wish I could do that. I think that the model that I would see is that some of these technologies, and this is what people come, when I say, why are we spending all this time talking about human germline editing when we can't even deliver these type of treatments to the people who really need it? And I am told backwards that, and it's probably true, that these new technologies, in a sense, almost have to be developed in the first world first, because that's where it is the money to develop them. But then you really have to challenge the companies and the developers to think about how to translate it to the developing world. It should be governments who do that, but if you take the example of HIV and retroviral treatments for HIV, in the end, governments, the US government actually pushed the pharma companies to make those drugs available at a cheap price to Africa, and it's changed AIDS around the world. So, but it has to, I think it's going to be the same way. We're going to see gene editing come forward in the developed world, but it is a technology that, with the right approaches, should be something that could be developed as a broader treatment. But it's going to require the Gates Foundation or other groups to come in and work with the companies, I think. I may be completely wrong, and maybe this is never going to happen, but I know that some of the leaders in the gene editing field actually are looking at cheap kinds of approaches with gene editing. So, for example, Feng Zhang and his group at the Broad are developing point-of-care diagnostic tools for various viruses that are prevalent in Africa. So cheap little strips based on CRISPR analysis that you'll be able to use cheaply around the world. So that's the first step. So I think there is a desire among scientists too, not just to make money, but to really make a difference. It's not going to be me, and I'm maybe barking up completely the wrong tree, but I do think we're going to see those things in the future.
Okay, so I cannot see a better way to finish our panel discussion. I think we came a long way since early in the morning. I think it's obvious for all of us that stem cell research has been paving an amazing way. But it has a lot of hypes, and if I may say, raising a lot of buzz. So this means that we have to be extremely careful. But I would like to have confident note, which is, I think it's another tool that we as humans, if we all work together, and when I mean work together, it's not only across different countries, different civilizations, but also across different expertise, right? We need the medical doctors, we need the scientists, we need the people helping the medical doctors, the scientists, and the patients with correct legislation, and we need to communicate well. So I would like to finish just thanking the audience because you have been so nicely engaged in promoting the discussion and really bringing excellent questions for our for speakers here that I would like you all to for another round of applause for them because thank you.